Now, as an experienced gamer, and I am being a bit delicate there because what I really mean to say is an old gamer, Gen X, and possibly even on the cusp of Gen X millennial, when you think of the year 2000, you still think of it as the future. And rightly so, because in the year 2000, we got this. The Sony PlayStation 2, and it was the future. And if you want to see my top 10 games on the PlayStation 2, well, you just wait until right after these. Now there's a couple of things that I would like to get crystal clear before we start with this top 10 list. The first thing being that this is my top 10 list, not your top 10 list, so if your list and my list don't compare, then drop down into the comments and let me know what your top 10 PlayStation 2 games are. Now I have also set myself a few rules, the first one being only games that I have in the current collection, second one being only games that I actually played during their launch window, and third one, only one game per franchise, so I'm not going to get to fill this list up with Final Fantasy games, I'm sure you're happy to hear. So without further ado, let's get on to the actual top 10 PlayStation 2 games in my collection that I played back in the day. And we're starting of course with number 10, and that game is Coden. Now of course Coden won't be everyone's cup of tea because it is quite frankly a real-time strategy combat game. But of course for someone like myself who came through the early part of the 90s playing mostly on PC, a real-time strategy game such as Coden made me feel right at home. Add on to that, the game is set in feudal Japan times, a period of history that I'm totally in love with, and of course that made it a surefire winner for me. Now of course looking back from 2024 the graphics don't look that spectacular, but in the year 2000, moving away from the Sony PlayStation onto the PlayStation 2, there was an absolutely seismic shift in graphical fidelity, and that's before we even mention the storage capacity of DVD discs compared to the CD discs that the original PlayStation used. So if you like a bit of feudal Japan in your life and can quite happily sit for hours strategizing your next battle plan, then Coden may be for you if you haven't played it already. There were another 2 games in the series, but the first one has its place in my heart, and at my number 10 of PlayStation 2 games currently in my collection that I played when they first came out, number 10, Coden. Now coming in at number 9 in my top 10 PlayStation 2 games that I have in my collection that I played back in the day is a licensed game, and an action licensed game, and that is Buffy the Vampire Slayer Chaos Bleeds. Now I'm not going to try and tell you that Chaos Bleeds is one of the best games ever made for the PlayStation 2, because without a doubt it's absolutely not one of the best games. Now it isn't one of the worst games either, but the thing about this game is it's from a franchise that I absolutely adored, and so did many of you out there watching this too likely. And let me tell you, as someone who grew up with video games from the 70s right through the 80s and onwards, just managing to get your hand on one licensed video game from a license that you absolutely adore that plays okay does tend to push it up in your own personal rankings more than it possibly deserves. But what truly elevated this for me was the fact that not only did you get to play as Buffy, but you also got to play as the underpowered San Andreas, the magical Willem Rosenberg, and of course that bad boy of the vampires, Spike. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer Chaos Bleeds is my number 9 game in my collection that I played back in the day on the PlayStation 2. If it's yours, then you can let me know that in the comments. Coming in at number 8 is a sports title, and it's the only sports title in this particular list because it's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Now the thing about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is that it was the very first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game that I ever played. And not only that, it was a game that I absolutely didn't want at the time. For me, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 came into my collection because I was buying another PlayStation 2 and this game bundled with it. Now I did ask the people in the store when I was purchasing that PlayStation 2 bundle if I needed to take Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 with me. I gave them the option of trading it out for another game, and I gave them the option of just keeping the game for themselves, but they did insist that I had to take Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 home with me, and I'm very glad that I did, because despite all my lack of care for the title when I first encountered it in that store, after biting the bullet and sitting down with a couple of friends, a few beers and some time on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, it probably became my most played game of that year. Now of course I hear many people still talking about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1, 2 and 3 and how easy it is to just sit down, let muscle memory take over and play a good few hours of your favourite skateboarding game. For me, however, there seems to be no muscle memory there, and to get as good as I was back in the 2000s, I'd have to put a few more hours into this game. It is a game that's well worth the time, and I highly recommend if you haven't played any Tony Hawk's games, then 3's a good one to go with. But for me, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is my number 8 game in my collection for a PlayStation 2 that I played back in the day. Now coming into number 7 is a game that's probably going to be on many top 10 PlayStation 2 lists, because that game is Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. Now, although I do say that this game will be on a lot of lists when it comes to the PlayStation 2, it is also a game that caused a bit of a divide in the Metal Gear fanbase. Now, most of that divide came from the fact that there was the switcheroo from Solid Snake to Raiden, but for me that made the game oh so much better. Not that I don't like playing as Solid Snake, but you see so many franchises, we like the same character year after year and it starts to get a bit old, and not so much the game or the gameplay mechanics associated to that particular gaming franchise, but just overusing the same character when they could quite easily, like in Metal Gear Solid 2, slide in a new character and give it just a little bit extra spice. Now I imagine there could be a fair bit of discussion down in the comments, and feel free to do that if you think I've got Metal Gear Solid 2 in the wrong spot, or whether you even think it should be in the list at all. That's what the comments are for, and I'll happily have a chinwag with you about that. But for me, number 7, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, and that's where it's going to stay just now. Coming in at number 6 is another game from another big franchise, and not only that, it's a franchise that dragged me away from PC gaming and put me firmly in the console gaming space. That, of course, was Resident Evil, and my number 6 game on the PlayStation 2 is Code Veronica X. Now for me, and I've said this time and time again, Code Veronica X was the last great Resident Evil game, if not the last proper Resident Evil game. And I know that will absolutely cause a stushy down in the comments. But have at it, people, because you're very unlikely to convince me that Resident Evil 4 through Resident Evil 8 are actually what you could call proper Resident Evil games. Now I will concede that 7 and 8 started to edge back towards the area that they should be, but for me, Resident Evil finished with Resident Evil Code Veronica X, and it kinda surprised even me that this game only made it this far up my list. So number 6, Resident Evil Code Veronica X, the last great Resident Evil game. So now we're down to the top 5, and this is a serious part of the list. This is a list where the games that you're about to see were games that I played so often I could probably play them blindfolded. And the first one, number 5, is a game from another big franchise, a franchise that started on the Sony PlayStation, not the PlayStation 2, and that is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about which is the best Grand Theft Auto game, and I'll quite happily die on the hill that San Andreas is not only the greatest Grand Theft Auto from the Grand Theft Auto 3 trilogy, but is also the greatest Grand Theft Auto game that there has ever been. And for me, the biggest part of that is because Carl Johnson, the main protagonist, really doesn't want to be dragged back into the criminal underworld. He's just a poor soul who's done his time, he's went to his mother's funeral and get dragged back in by bent coppers no less. And if that doesn't make you want to play GTA San Andreas and help Carol get to where he wants to be rather than where he's forced to be, then I don't know what will. But Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, definitely my top 5 PS2 game from my collection that I played back in the day when it was released, and it's an absolute stone cold classic. Now, for anyone who knows me and knows my channel will be quite surprised that we've made it all the way to the number 4 game and we haven't seen a single RPG. Well, that's all about to change, because my number 4 game for the PlayStation 2, currently in my collection that I played back when it came out, is none other than Lord of the Rings The Third Age. Now, this is a game that doesn't get nearly as much love as it should do. Most people, when they talk about Lord of the Rings games, or especially from the PlayStation 2 era, talk about Return of the King, Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. They of course are much more action hack and slash, and The Third Age is what I like to call a Western developed JRPG, because it's not a Western RPG such as Skyrim, The Elder Scrolls or the Fallout series, and it's not even a CRPG like Diablo and the likes. It's a game that takes place just after the Hobbit hobbits go on their big adventure and you follow just behind them. It's also linked to the Peter Jackson movie trilogy, so there's plenty of great footage and all the characters that you know and love from the films are all in here. The only difference, as I said, you're a different party and you're just following behind the first party. The combat is turn-based, which is my absolute favourite, and chef's kiss, the combat in this is absolutely fantastic, and so is the levelling system. Now, if you haven't played this and you're a fan of Lord of the Rings or a fan of JRPGs, then I heartily recommend you get yourself out, get a copy of this game and get it played, because it really is fantastic. A Western made JRPG, and you don't get many of them, let me tell you. I have looked, there are a couple, but this here is one of the cream of the crop, and it's my number 4 on my PlayStation 2 games currently in my collection that I played back in the day, and there you go. Now, of course, you knew that there were going to be JRPGs at the top of the list, and at number 3 there's no exception there, because my number 3 game on the PlayStation 2 that I currently have in my collection that I played back in the day is Grandia II. Now, Grandia II is an absolute classic JRPG with turn-based combat, but with a slight difference. Now, if there's one thing that I love just a little bit more than just plain vanilla turn-based combat, it's turn-based combat that has an unusual or unique game mechanic just to spice it up a little bit. And with Grandia II, it was the first time that I had played a turn-based combat game that my action could actually stall the action of an enemy. And if you haven't played Grandia II, then I heartily recommend that you get yourself a copy. It's not that expensive, easy to pick up, and it's my number 3 game on the PlayStation 2 from my collection that I played back in the day. Now, for anyone who's watched my previous top 10 PlayStation games that are from my collection that I played back in the day, will know that the top 2 games, there was a bit of a standoff, a bit of a battle, and it's exactly the same here, because coming in at number 2 we have Coden 4. Now, Coden 4 is not one of the most loved games in the Coden series, and I seriously don't understand why. Over here in PAL territories we didn't get Coden 3, so we had to wait until this came out to get our hands on our first 3D Coden game. Now, of course, the first 2 are absolute classics, and Coden 2 is the greatest game of all time in my opinion, and if you want to discuss that down in the comments, feel free to do that, or if you want to pop over and do that in the comments of the top 10 PlayStation games, there'll be a link in the description for you to go there too. But Coden 4 was the first 3D Coden game that I managed to get my hands on and play, and I absolutely adored it. It had everything in it that I wanted for a Coden game. We had the 108 Stars of Destiny, we had great turn-based combat, we had the rune magic system, and of course we had the castle. But the castle in Coden 4 is a great big ship, and I can't explain to you how that made me feel, because I absolutely loved it. I know a lot of people didn't quite get on with it, but for me, Coden 4 was another masterpiece in the Coden franchise, and it's my number 2 game on the PlayStation 2 that I have in my collection that I played back in the day. So now we're down to the last one. It's my number 1 PlayStation 2 game that's in my collection that I played back in the day. And anyone who's watched the channel will probably take a fair stab at guessing what this game's going to be. It is a JRPG, there was going to be no doubt about that. And of course, it's Final Fantasy X. Now, I'm fairly confident that there's not many people out there that will drop down into the comments and argue that Final Fantasy X doesn't deserve to be a number 1 game in a PlayStation 2 list. And if you do want to drop down into the comments and state that, I will get back down there and have the debate with you that you're wrong, and that's where that argument's going to end. Because Final Fantasy X, very much like Code Veronica X, was the very last true Final Fantasy game in the series. Now, of course, we've had up to Final Fantasy 16, and let me tell you, I haven't played any of the online games, so I can't really comment on them, but the mainline games that were released in console after 10, they just don't feel like Final Fantasy games. I do understand the developers wanted to move on, do different things, but the fan base often doesn't, and that's why Final Fantasy X for me and a lot of other people is the very last Final Fantasy game that you can get your hands on. The graphics are stunning, the script's perfect, and Blitzball, I could play Blitzball all day. I'm surprised that Square didn't put out a standalone Blitzball game, because there's a sports title I could get behind. So Final Fantasy X, number 1 game in my PlayStation 2 collection that I played back in the day. And what did you think? So there you have it, my friends, that's my top 10 PlayStation 2 games that I currently have in my collection that I played back in the day. And what did you think of that list? Is there any games in that list that you think I shouldn't have on that list? Anything that you would like to add in yourself? And if so, drop that down in the comments, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. Thank you as always for watching, and until next time, of course, cheerio. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out the other ones on offer here, and also feel free to subscribe if you want to see more in the future.